The banks, in forgiving businesses loan repayments for 6 months, this is an enormously significant breathing space that the banks have given business. It's a chance for the banks to redeem themselves, I suppose, given the recent history. Just how crucial do you think this will be, and what difference will it make to the bank's survivability as well?
Chris, I think banks are going to be central to the national response throughout this crisis, and what they did on Friday was throw an absolutely critical lifeline to the small businesses that employ 5 million Australians. What this means, as you said, is breathing space. 6 months without having to make a payment on your loan. And I should say it's all of the loans associated with the business, so it might also include, as you know, many small businesses might have their business loan secured by their home, so it would include the mortgage on the home as well. I should say that the banks have also extended this to mortgage holders. As you saw on those tragic Centrelink lines today, there are thousands of people out of work, and they'll be worried about their mortgages. This opportunity is there for them as well. And I think, as I said at the beginning, banks have, have been there when Australia's gone through difficult times before, but they're going to be absolutely critical as we get through this one.
Now, we've seen the trouble that Centrelink has had dealing with people today wanting assistance. What's the response been in bank customers going to banks today? Have you been able to handle the level of inquiries, and how do people go about accessing this sort of loan relief, this loan holiday that people are going to need?
Chris, they need to contact their bank. It's a very straightforward process when they do get onto the bank, but it's not the usual, lots and lots of paperwork. They've been able to fast-track this with some good work last week, not only from banks but with their regulators. I do know that banks have all told me that their response times on their call centres are blowing out. I think people can expect that they will be on the call for a while and having to hold. They are all putting additional staff into their call centres, and I would just ask people to recognise that they've moved very quickly on this. It will make a huge difference, but it might require a bit of patience on the phone.
It's such an unusual crisis that we're facing here, so because it's so unique, there are unique responses to it. I suppose the key here for banks is that you are assuming that once we get to the other side of it, whether it's through a vaccine or the like, then most business should be able to recover very quickly. And so you just want, as banks, to keep them as customers so that they'll be there to revive on the other side of it.
That's exactly right. Banks have in many cases have a very long-term relationship with many of their business customers. They might have been banking them for 10 years or more. They know these businesses very well. And when you've had a thriving business until something like this beyond your control hits you, banks know that when we are able to lift all of these controls and we're on the other side, they want to see those customers back and thriving again. The 6 month has been picked because that's the time frame the government is working around. Just as the government has said it's evolving and might have to be reconsidered, banks will do the same. This is about absolute optimism that regardless of how dark and grim it gets in the next weeks and months, there is an end to it. There is another side on the other end, and we want to make sure that everybody, homeowners and businesses, can be back on their feet as quickly as possible.
Tell me about how mortgage holders access this, and how do they qualify? Presumably the first cab off the rank is anybody whose business has had to close down or has lost their job.
Chris, they're going straight into call centres. They can also talk to people in their branches, and those people, whoever gets onto the phone, will also be helped. Of course, in business banks, there are also people who have their own customer lists, and they'll be calling out to those customers as well wherever possible. So in some cases, it's businesses having to call in. In others, but some banks will be able to make outbound calls to check on the people that they work with regularly. But as I say, this whole thing is going to take goodwill and patience, and the people on the end of those phone lines are You know, Australians, just like everybody else, they're worried about themselves and their families, but they're still coming in on those front lines to make sure that they can get this package to people as quickly as possible.
Now, it differs from sector to sector, but of course, while small businesses have been hit particularly hard and particularly quickly, some big businesses are being hit. Will the financial services sector survive strongly? Will the banks be able to maintain everybody they currently employ throughout this crisis?
What I can say is that Australian banks right now are better placed to face into a challenge like this than they've ever been. They are more strongly capitalised than they've ever been, so they've got the buffers to deal with something like this. Their balance sheets are stronger than they've ever been, and you know, that's why they are in a position to do what they're doing. Of course, none of us knows what's there in the future, but I think what you're going to see is Australian banks leaning in and leaning in very hard to support their customers through this, because ultimately that's what's going to drive the Australian economy when we get to the other end.
Anna Bligh, I think most Australians recall you leading Queensland at a time of crisis during the floods, which I had to check today. I didn't realise 9 years ago already. But you had that experience of leading a state through a crisis. So I wonder if you could just share with us your thoughts now on the national leadership. We've got state and federal leaders, we've got Labor and Liberal leaders, we've got a national cabinet instituted for the first time. What's your assessment of the level of national leadership we've got at the moment and how it could be improved?
Well, firstly, Chris, I would note that while I did have to deal with a very catastrophic disaster in Queensland, it was not of the scale that we are facing now as a nation. Nevertheless, I think there are very similar experiences on the inside of one of these things. And when I reflect back, I think it is fair to say that what was absolutely critical at all times was the full cooperation between all of the different arms of government and all of the different levels of government. I think the National Cabinet is a very, very important vehicle to deliver national consistency and decisions that will work in the interests of different states, because they're all very different. And I think, as you said at the beginning, it's not going to be perfect, and you know, it's not always going to work 100%. But I know from having sat around similar tables that everybody there, regardless of what side of politics they're from, they walk into that room with the public interest front of mind, the health and well-being and safety of the people they represent. You know, I think I'm very pleased to see the National Cabinet up and running and fully operational. I think it's a great vehicle to ensure that we get the best possible answers to some of the challenges that we don't even know we're yet to face.
Perhaps we need to see more of the decision-making coming through the National Committee, the National Cabinet meetings, and announced jointly rather than so much autonomy from the states? Regardless of who's right, I'm not making judgments on the decisions, but do you think it would be better for Australians if we saw most things announced in a unified way?
Chris, I think that's what they're trying to do. As I said, you know, maybe there was a bit of a hiccup in the last 24 hours, but I do think it's important that we give the people who are around that table, as you said earlier, who day after day are having to make decisions off a list of bad decisions, you know, bad endings. They're trying to decide what is the least bad option and what will do the most to protect people's health, and also what will do the most to help the economy and keep people economically safe and financially safe. So, you know, I'm not at that table, and I'm not going to comment on what, you know, the decisions that people are making. But I do think it is commendable that all levels of government have agreed to be part of this National Cabinet. I think it would be a very different place today if that National Cabinet hadn't started meeting weeks ago. But it is bound from time to time. In hindsight, they might think, wish we'd done that differently. But I don't think we get very far with daily petty, you know, quibbling and criticising. They've got the toughest job of all. And I think they deserve our support to get them through it. Yeah,
well said. I agree with that. I just want to ask you, though, one final question. And again, as this national observation, we're seeing here now travel bans imposed by states. States closing their borders. Queensland, Tasmania, South Australia. Extraordinary. It's nothing any of us would have contemplated a couple of months ago. But to me, it is a worry. We understand the reasoning, but it really strikes at the heart of the federation. Your thoughts on that?
Chris, you're absolutely right. We are all looking now at situations that were unimaginable, that really could not have been imagined in our lifetime. And I think the borders closing is one example of that. If that stops this virus moving around, then that will help people on both sides of that border. What I do know is that we won't get through this thing unless everyone pulls together, and the institutions that serve our country, our parliaments, corporate Australia, religious institutions, community organisations, we're all going to have to play our part. That's what banks did last week. It's what they're doing today. It's what they're going to keep doing. And I'm very confident that you're going to see that from the rest of corporate Australia.
Anna Bligh, thanks for your time.
Thank you.